Hi, my name is Tim Chase, and welcome to this final session entitled "Manufacturing Cybersecurity in the Age of AI." So our panelists for this call is Mark Toussaint, James Turner, and Itay Glick. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you guys to introduce yourself for a few minutes here.
Okay, I'm Mark Toussaint. I'm a principal product manager here at OPSWAT. I'm responsible for OPSWAT's line of data diodes and security gateways.
Excellent.
My name is Itay Glick. I'm the GM of hardware and OT security here in OPSWAT, responsible for the OT security product lines developed by OPSWAT with roughly 25 years of experience in cyber.
Perfect.
And I'm James Turner. I am the senior OT solution engineer, focused and dedicated in OT cybersecurity. It's been my whole life.
Excellent. As I mentioned, I'm Tim Chase. Been doing information sharing for a decade, manage the manufacturing ISAC. So we're going to have a great conversation today around, AI and for manufacturing. So we're gonna have several polls during this call, and if you could just answer briefly, don't take too long thinking about it because we're gonna open the poll up and then it's gonna close in 20 to 30 seconds. That way we can get kind of initial responses from people. So with that said, we're gonna go ahead and launch our first poll. The question is, what is your biggest cybersecurity concern in your manufacturing environment today? We've got some choices there. USB drives, files, movable data, vendors inside your network, data flows, limited visibility. Go ahead and check what you want. All right. We'll take a look at that. Yeah, pretty evenly split. Not surprised by the results. Excellent. Well, we're going to keep moving on. So for the panelists, how is AI actually changing, or is it changing kind of the threat model or the threat calculus for manufacturers?
So I'll have to take that question. Thank you, Tim. So I think that the most important thing when AI comes in is the capability of a malware to be autonomous inside the network of the organization. Now, till now, when they were playing in the IT area, they had communication back to their command and control. So they didn't need AI. As soon as you wanted to move to the OT, they were a little bit stuck and they didn't know what to do when they were inside that network. So now when they're inside the network with the autonomous and agentic capabilities of AI, they can stroll around, check things out, rebuild themselves till they get to the information they need, till they get and create the damage that they wanted to inflict to the organization. So the threat and the risk just got much, much higher. The second thing that happens is information. Everybody knows, and especially for AI, you need to bring more information to the cloud. You need to bring from the OT some parameters, some information from the different sensors that you have in your network to somewhere in the cloud. So everything, the connectivity is there, and you cannot always say, okay, it's air gap, no risk, no problem, it's an island. There's starting to be more and more holes in your OT network, and we need to think how we can secure all of those holes to enable AI for the OT organization.
Yeah, maybe a slightly deeper question to that is you sort of picked up on at the end there, which is basically how the AI and the necessary infrastructure that it requires expanding the attack surface.
Yeah, I think that there's no doubt about that. There's pros and cons that are brought to the table with AI. And Itai talked about that as we're engaging with, cloud-based AI, and we're potentially opening up threat vectors, into the OT network, and we've expanded that, those areas of vulnerability. AI engines can also be, called data poisoning. So, there could be, how do you know that the AI data that you're getting is good in the event that, your AI engine has been attacked? But on the positive side, some of the AI capabilities now are able to look at the network traffic going on inside the OT network, and through things like machine learning, understand and learn the data patterns on a day-to-day basis, and then identify vulnerabilities, in anomalies in the traffic flow.
Right.
In addition, the looking at some of the capabilities that bring AI brings. Now, we have predictive AI tools to look at files coming into the OT network and very quickly make a determination whether that file poses risk before file can be detonated and things like that. So it's a mix of positive aspects as well as negative aspects.
Yeah, that's a really good point, which sort of leads into the next question, which is manufacturing is the most targeted critical infrastructure sector, more than any other, and for 5 years kind of running now. Um, so we're talking about AI introducing additional risk, expanding the attack surface, but is it possible that that also is a force for good? So is it a tool for defenders now as well?
I'll take that one. So I would say yes, but I think that again, what's interesting about the whole AI conversation is that AI has always been in manufacturing. We called it machine learning, right? It's been here
Right.
a very, very long time. What's really interesting, though, and at least to think about, is that now with models being deployed in that infrastructure, the question would be, how can we protect those models as far as the data ingress coming into them? How can we make sure that the data that the model is using is clean? How can we make sure that the model itself cannot be used to generate malware used in the environment? So I think that we really have an opportunity to put in place the controls around AI, at least how it's used, because in my mind, and the way I see this is really AI powering defenses and AI powered offensive. Like that's really what it's going to come down to, as ridiculous as it sounds, AI playing AI. And
Yeah.
that it's really the only way that it's going to be solved, but it's a matter of defending your own AI in those environments with clean data.
Yeah. Well, kind of moving that forward a little bit. So where where are you seeing that the manufacturers have the most exposure right now? Is it, coming back to that poll, is it files, devices, data flows, all the above?
I think it's really all of the above. How do you move files securely into your OT network? And then how do you get monitoring data, out of the OT network? And when I engage with customers, often I ask them that they need to understand their data flows, what's coming in, what's coming out. And often they don't. There's not an understanding. I always tell the story. I was at Distributech a number of years ago, and a presenter was talking about looking at connections in and out of OT, and they identified 139 connections. Many of them they were unaware of. So it's
Hmm.
really important to understand, what connections you have coming in and out. Um, and from that starting point of understanding what you have, then you can look at, for getting data out of OT, different segmentation methodologies to ensure that, data can only flow in one way in an intended direction in a deterministic manner. So that's typically, when we look at data flows coming into and out of, start by understanding what they are, and then begin by looking at, how do we sanitize files that are coming in? How do we ensure that data can only move one way, out of the OT network into the IT network?
Yeah,
Okay, I
so
think
that's about the files. What about the physical hardware? So USB drives, vendor laptops that are coming into those OT networks. How do we sanitize them, so to speak?
so. I think in practical terms, making sure that one, we've got policies that are compliant with that, right? So we want to make sure that, and this is what I see. This is what I see in the industry. And I always have these questions. Okay, how do you move USBs in? How do you allow contractors to bring USBs in? There was a conversation the other day that I had where the guy on the other end was like, yeah, and they usually come in and they've got a whole string of a lanyard full of USBs that they use for different purposes, and he was just astounded, and I was astounded that he had said that. But really, it's a matter of making sure that there's policies in place, and then the enforcement of those policies. So that might be something as simple as locking down those USBs to what's permissible, right? In Active Directory and in Linux, you can tell it which USBs are allowed to be plugged in. What are the devices that are allowed to be plugged into this system? And in doing so, now you have a mechanism to say, I've got my own clean USBs, or I've got my own clean laptops, if you will. And anything that we want to bring into the facility that we've scanned and we've transferred the files and then we've brought them into our clean USB or put them onto our clean laptop, and not even worry necessarily about the vendor laptops.
Yeah.
I think we need to be ready for multiple aspects. So like a USB device is not only a file that can contain malwares, it can also contain threats like bad USB, and we need to be prepared that somebody would come with that to the organization. So in the process, we really need to validate why even he needs a USB, why does he get to get the laptop in, and if he needs it, make sure you have the right mechanism to support it.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, we are now to our second poll, so we can bring that up. How does your organization handle files, removable media entering the plant floor? So we've talked a little bit about how we should secure those, and now we're going to ask you how you do that.
And Tim, one of the things I want to mention though is, sometimes our cell phones are also a mechanism or a means by which files can be carried into a facility. So I think oftentimes we've got to be careful about what all we're letting in.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I've got plenty of stories about removable media and from friends in critical infrastructure. All right, we'll go ahead and close that poll and see what people think. Yeah, okay. Well, I'm glad to see that the percentage is as high as it is that they scan everything going into the OT network, because that hasn't always been 30%. So good to see that. But obviously, some room to grow in terms of creating a program and policies around doing that. All right, so moving on, OPSWAT has kind of a slogan. I don't know if it's trademarked or whatever, but it's like the trust no file, trust no device, control every data flow. What does that look like in a manufacturing environment?
Itay, I don't know if you want to start with this one, but I'm happy to at least address how it starts, right? It's again going back into the policy piece of things, but the thoughts and considerations should not only be how files are ingress, but also files are egress. In a real zero trust world, we're also looking at files when they leave, right? Can we scan those files and make sure that if we're pulling data off of a PLC, some process values, or we're pulling data out of SCADA, that we're taking those files and also scanning them on the egress, right? Making sure that we're saying, hey, we're assuming that we're already compromised, therefore scan on the way out too. But it's really about controlling those data flows, and what that means is scrutinize everything. Even again, back to the feeding AI models, scrutinize the files that are feeding into those data models.
I would jump quickly here, and I would say that one of the things that I really admire in OT in general is that everything is hardware enforced. You always have a fail-safe mechanism. You also always have a big red button. Everything is meant to keep the organization safe. Same thing should be with the security controls that you put in place. They should be hardware enforced, not allowing the user to do a mistake, because sometimes there is urgency, sometimes he's tired, sometimes it's somebody new. If
Right.
you build the right software solution in place, you don't have that problem of lack of misuse, and eventually you get an hardware enforced OT security facility.
Yeah. Well, let's keep drilling down on this. I want to know, vendor shows up to the plant and he's got a laptop and a USB drive for servicing, equipment. What happens? What would you how would you actually enforce that before they go into the OT network?
I'll
Well,
take
so,
the laptop side. Oh, okay, James.
Yeah, please, Itay. Go ahead.
I'll take the laptop side because I really am feeling really connected to that. So the problem with the laptop is that you cannot trust the OS that it is. Even if it says, so, yeah, you know what? I have CrowdStrike, Microsoft Defender installed and they
Right.
are operational and I just did a scan last night and everything is okay. Let me in. No, you still can't trust that. You need to make sure that you're evaluating that device with your own security stack. And that could mean either to boot up the device on a fresh OS and do a full scan of the device, or to do a quick scan directly on the device if you cannot shut it down. So eventually you'll get a device that you've validated just like any other device in your organization and made sure that it's safe to connect.
Yeah. He did a scan just last night, but he was also sitting on the dirty Hampton Inn hotel Wi-Fi. So yeah,
Yeah.
maybe on the thumb drive, James. I don't know if you got
Yeah.
the hardware side.
Well, yeah. So there's more to the story too, right? When we're talking about the people who are using this equipment, it has to be easy and it has to be fast because the one thing that you don't want is you don't want that contractor who you brought into the facility and you're paying hourly and you know this is costing you every minute that he's sitting there waiting for a USB to be scanned. So it's got to be fast. It's got to be thorough because again, we're talking about sensitive equipment. This is stuff that, ultimately is going to impact our process if it's bad. And so it's got to be fast. It's got to be thorough and it's got to be easy to use. So it can't be super complex and, this weird and strange process. So, in practical terms, if there's an exchange of USBs, meaning the contractor comes in with their USB, it's plugged in to, say, a kiosk that is specifically dedicated for that purpose. It stands by itself, looks like an ATM even, right? You
Right.
know the purpose of this device. Then the files that are clean, meaning that if we did a scan, we saw something that wasn't good, we're not going to copy that file over. Let's do some triage here and understand what that is, but move those files over to a clean device, take that clean device into the facility, and maybe even at each of the eye wash stations or at each of the first aid kits, that you've also got a cybersecurity awareness campaign poster that says, if it's not our green USB, then it's not a clean USB. Something simple like that, where you're reinforcing the idea of security around this, because most of those people who are, in OT, the reality is number one, safety, right? That is the most important thing in OT. Anything we do, it's got to be safe. We have to make sure we're protecting the people, right? And second is reliability, but first is safety. And so when we start getting engineers thinking in the safety mindset and saying security is really safety, or the cybersecurity, and these files are really about safety, that's where you start to make an impact. So it's a matter of getting that message out there and getting those policies in place.
Yeah, totally agree. So we talked about the data in, and James, you talked a little bit about the bidirectionality of this, but manufacturing now, there's almost no manufacturer that, and I was just talking to somebody where they haven't actually started in earnest their AI program, but they know that they are, and they've kind of charted their roadmap. But they started, which I think is super smart. They started by opening that pipeline to the cloud. So they're shooting telemetry data and other process data to the cloud, knowing that they're going to have an AI program and that it's going to train on that data, so that it's going to actually decrease the amount of time to actual usefulness. But what that means is, for all kinds of reasons, there's a lot more connectivity to cloud-based assets and others than there used to be. So how are we securing that pipeline?
You know
yeah,
what?
well,
I'm going to start with Mark here because Mark is going to be the guy.
yeah, historically, going back, customers had air gaps,
Right.
but air gaps are not practical. So a lot of customers are using firewalls. And the problem inherent in firewalls is that they're bidirectional by nature, and they share routable information between networks. So they don't protect any network confidentiality. And last but not least, they're rules-based, and they rely on setting up rules, uh, to ensure that data flows properly. they can be very prone to human error. You may have on a enterprise firewall 700 different connections or data flows. What's the likelihood that you haven't made any errors and left open ports, things
Right.
like that? So we work with customers, and deploy things like data diodes to ensure that data can only flow unidirectionally out of OT into IT. And we also, the nature of a diode, because it's based on the laws of physics, it
Right.
uses hardware to enforce that unidirectional data flow. There's complete network confidentiality between the OT
Right.
network and the IT network. Neither network knows that the other one exists. So it provides a level of network confidentiality, yet can provide that data to the cloud, or for your analytics, your predictive maintenance, for your remote monitoring. So that's typically how we're doing that. And we have a lot of customers. All you need to do is do a search on the internet, and you can see uh, over and over again firewall vulnerabilities that
Right.
firewalls can be breached. And many of our customers have come to the conclusion that firewalls just are not good enough to protect
Right.
those OT networks and OT assets.
Yeah, I mean, I think that um, to Itai's point that in OT there should always be a hardware enforcement, and in that sense, like the normal kind of firewalls are essentially just they're just code that is doing its enforcement via logic, but not physical processes. So yeah, the data diodes physically do not allow things to go either way.
Yeah, and when I talked earlier about understanding all the data flows that you have, and assuming that you do, we advocate to customers, we want to enforce data flows so that we have one way out of OT over a diode, one way in for moving files, patches, software updates into OT, and that we restrict those data flows so they have no back channel. And that's sort of a goal that we try to align our customers with. This is where you want to get to. And along the lines, and looking at all those data flows that I talked about, what are the most important critical data flows to protect? What are the most critical assets in the OT network that you want to protect? Very often, customers come to us, and one of the first use cases that they have is they want to protect their Aviva Pi historian database,
Right.
because that is the crown jewel of data on which they run their business. So that very frequently is, one of the first use cases customers come to us with, looking to secure their Aviva Pi databases.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, data diodes are obviously not the solution for every installation, but for critical systems, I think that yeah, they're a very important aspect. So we are at the point that we're going to do our third poll, and we can bring that up. So the question is, how do you control data flows from your OT environment to IT or cloud systems? So a few different hardware enforced firewall rules, software, VPN, and you don't know. Obviously, some of those things can be used in conjunction with one another. I wouldn't suggest having a ingress point into an OT environment, whether or not you're using kind of software-based firewalls or a data diode without some sort of secure access to that. So yeah, probably best in combination. Okay, excellent. I am heartened to see so many people are using hardware enforcement. That's great. Excellent. All right. Well, we'll move on. So, we've seen some really, really big attacks early this year and late last year. So things like Striker, 200,000 systems wiped, 50 terabytes data stolen, 80 offices affected. Also, JLR, Jaguar Land Rover, over a month of downtime. I mean, I think with their bailout package, we're over $2 billion for the whole thing. Um, what should manufacturers be taking away from this? Because there's a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Um, how can we help them to think about them not falling into this category?
Well, I think, when I, talk to CISOs, and they ask me things like, where do I get my biggest bang for the buck to get started? Uh, I recommend that, perimeter defense, OT network perimeter defense, is really a starting point for how do I protect the whole OT network. And, when we deploy data diodes and we enforce that unidirectional data flow, at the point of egress on the network, that diode enforces unidirectional data flow and doesn't allow anything to flow back into OT. And the reason that often is a first step is because if you protect that network boundary with a diode or similar type technology, if you have vulnerabilities behind that diode in the OT network, you will still be protected from anything attacking. Maybe you have an unpatched PLC or things like that. Because data can only flow in one direction, nothing can get to those PLCs. Now, there are additional types of network segmentation. After you have looked at perimeter defense, you may want to look at protecting specific assets or deploy things like industrial firewalls to prevent lateral movement across the OT network. So in the event that you do have a breach in one area, it's difficult to propagate, across the network laterally. So typically, that's where, from my perspective, it's a really look at the OT network perimeter boundary for getting data out as well as data in as, where you get started.
Yeah. Anyone else want to touch on that before we move on?
It's defensible architecture, right?
Right.
That's exactly what Mark said, right? And so if we're thinking about things from a defensible architecture standpoint, we're also thinking about it from, okay, here's what segmentation looks like. Here's what our data flows look like. And I think one of the things that we too often are accepting of is, oh, well, I have EDR on this device, right? Or, we've got methods for detecting when this thing happens. So I'm going to use my EDR to check this USB. Okay, you have just taken this potentially malicious USB, plugged it into a device to see if it has this stuff on it, right? That should be happening outside of that environment, right? So making sure that we're real careful about our data flows and how files actually move into the network, whether it's across secure remote access or remote access. We call it that sometimes, right? Because we know that there's devices out there that just provide remote access over an encrypted connection, but not necessarily secure. But how these files are getting into these environments, right? That's what creating that defensible architecture around. But I also, I don't want to use the P word. The P word's a bad word around here, but still, if there's a way to patch and it makes sense and it can be done during downtime, it can be done when we know we've got scheduled outages, that should be happening. I mean, NERCSIP has their own set of requirements and the like, but the reality is, if you're removing those vulnerabilities, it also helps reduce your risk. So, Itay, your thoughts?
I think we need to remember that OT network is different than what we see in the IT. We would see computers that are 8, 10, 15 years old, meaning Windows XP, etc. So we need to see how we can patch them, how we can segregate them even more, how we can protect them. We cannot install on them the modern EDRs even. So they are completely exposed where they sit. And finally, in patching, in IT, you would patch every 30 days, maybe more in advanced organization. In OT, that's a problem. You don't want to shut down the entire organization when you patch the computer, but still you need to. So you need to be double careful. You need to be more careful about what you let in and to make sure that you're not impacted by that, because the cost at the end is not only money, like a lot of other organizations, if they get Jagger, yeah, money was impacted definitely, but in energy, nuclear, the cost could be even more dramatic. Could be
There are
human
physical
lives.
consequences. Yeah.
Yes.
All great answers. Agree with all of that. I'm going to actually pull up one of the questions because I think it's interesting. It's not exactly what we've been talking about, but this person was asking whether or not like IEC 62443 and NIST 800-82 should be revised with AI in mind inside of an industrial environment. I have thoughts, but I'd love to hear yours. Well, you think about your answer. This is my knee-jerk reaction, which is that if the AI, it may be inside of a network that is an operational technology network, but if that AI is not part of the control loop, then some of those standards wouldn't necessarily apply because they're really thinking about uh, the actual devices that are in the control plane and responsible for the control decisions and actuating those. So that's my simple thought. I mean, I'm sure that going forward, every single standard is going to have to contemplate what AI means for that standard and environment. But open to the panel.
Yeah, I think that it does need to be considered going forward in these standards. The challenge is these standards evolve very slowly. So you could be waiting 2, 3 years for an update on these standards to provide guidance in the AI world. So it's important that you're proactive in terms of, learning how to respond to some of the new challenges that AI. And, these regulations evolve very slowly, and compliance doesn't always equate to security.
Yeah. Slow progress on standards. Yeah, I was talking to someone at a OT cybersecurity conference, and they were involved from the beginning on what has become 62443 on the IEEE side, and he was saying that this was 15 years ago. So it takes a long time to get consensus on that. Anyone else want to touch on that before we move on?
I
I'll take a
think that,
stab at it too. Itay, you first.
no, go ahead.
All right. So 2 cents on it. The answer is yes. The answer is yes. Straight clarity, right? There's no. Does it need to be revised? Yes, it needs to be revised with AI in mind because AI is going to be involved with manufacturing. AI is going to be involved with writing the standards, right? Like there is no denying the fact that AI is here. That genie has been let out. And so now we have to live or consider what are the consequences, what are the impacts of having that genie out of the bottle now for all of our regulatory, for all of our standards, for all the things that we feel are best practices. So I do think that it's going to, it is necessary to rewrite that stuff. That's my 2 cents on it, just knee jerk like you, Tim.
Yeah.
But I think the changes would not only be what security controls you need to have, but more even of where you put devices, distance between devices, because an AI could be extremely smart and say, okay, I have this device here in the IT and the OT device is next to it because the person has an IT device and an OT device in his desk because he needs them. And the AI figure out a way to jump between one to another.
Uh,
So there would not be only implications on the software, but there would be only also implication about the facility. So it's very broad.
yeah. No, that's a really good point. Particularly, from folks inside of the organization, like you said, that are on that enterprise network, but also have access into engineering workstations inside the OT environment and how it might be able to move in between those. Excellent. All right. Well, moving on, we actually have another poll. So this poll four, as your organization invests more in AI, what's your top security priority for your AI? Files, feeding AI systems, controlling what devices can connect, secure data movement, or still piloting and assessing security?
I think AI governance is absolutely a whole, absolutely a topic, right? I mean, like how do we manage AI in our organization, not only from a policy standpoint, but acceptable use policies and how it's actually used. So I think there's good conversation around that, but it's going to result in all the standards being written, including how manufacturing occurs. So I think you're muted, Tim.
I was muted.
Yeah.
Yeah, so about 18 months ago, our organization and some representatives from CISA and some of the foundation model providers and some of the security companies came together. We put together a working group that ultimately had a product that was around AI security and governance. So I don't know if I can find the link in time, but it's free. It's good kind of boilerplate thing about things to think about in categories for enforcement. All right. Well, did we already see the results from that poll? Okay. All right. So we got two kind of clear winners in terms of what data is feeding the AI and then securing data flows between them. Yep. Makes sense. We got a very, very savvy group here. So, all right. Moving on. So if the audience is taking one thing away from this panel, what should it be? What's the single thing that they should be thinking about that they can do or steps they can take today?
Okay, I'll jump in. I think that what we need to understand is that AI multiply the productivity in manufacturing, which is great for everybody, but the risk for organization has just got much higher. Every AI use case that we deploy, whether it's for predictive maintenance, for QA, generative, creates another channel, another workflow of data to comes in. It creates more opportunities for the attackers to get in. It allows them to create more malicious malwares to get in and to spread inside the OT network. So the risk multiplied by AI. It's not that the threat changes, but the risk change, and the severity also didn't change. The severity was always, a nuclear shutdown, which we never want. But the risk of that happening just increased because of the introduction of AI to the attackers and to introduction of AI to facilities. So that's my takeaway from here.
Yeah, and I think that we've talked a lot about cybersecurity today, but there's also the concept of unified resilience, where we're not only looking at the cybersecurity aspects that we've mostly talked about today, but we're also looking at data security, ensuring that files are sanitized moving into the OT network, that we understand what types of traffic are flowing out of the OT network. And then how do you respond in the event that you do have an incident? Are you aligned or in a place where you can ensure business continuity? So taking a holistic look at, how am I implementing my cybersecurity, my policies? How am I securing my data? But then how am I ensuring, business continuity is really taking an overall approach to these problems.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's really important. Maybe we can drill down a little bit deeper on this where, you know, most manufacturers that are more actively engaging with AI, they're creating AI programs not only just for their enterprise side, but increasingly, obviously, for their production side. Um, Before there's a lot of spend, what what are the security foundations or other considerations that need to be in place before that happens, right? So it's most efficient and most impactful.
With respect to the old adage, garbage in, garbage out, right? Making sure that our inputs, doesn't matter if it's sensor inputs, it doesn't matter if it's file inputs, anything which is feeding AI needs to be clean, needs to be sanitized, or it needs to be at least, known that this is a good state so that when the data going in is good, that we know or can feel like we've got a better, I don't ever want to say completely trust, but a better trust in the outputs, right? In the end. So I think good stuff in and good stuff out is what's yielded. And I do think that there's methodologies out there. I think that's probably the one thing that I would suggest as a takeaway, and that there are solutions to these problems. It's just a matter of, yes, as you say, thinking about what its impact is going to be, what are the risks around it, and whether or not, we're putting the appropriate security controls for the data that's being fed into these systems.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, Maybe we'll take another question. So, one of the questions says, as many organizations import machines from different countries, Most of the cyber attacks are state-sponsored or APTs. In reference to these, how do you observe specific malicious activities, monitored via AI for such imported machines? Um, I'm interested in the panelists. I would say, first of all, just with my hat on as the director of manufacturing ISAC, I would say that I don't know that most of the attacks, however defining them, are necessarily APT attacks. Um, and and I would actually go further and say that since manufacturing is so targeted, most of the time that manufacturing is targeted and there is an operational disruption, in most of those cases, there's not even an intrusion into the OT space. What oftentimes happens, I read a lot of SEC AKs. What oftentimes happens is that something in the enterprise side, often in the ERP or something, is disrupted. There's a data pathway that's broken. Often that ERP system is feeding data into the operational environment, into the MES. And when that data stream stops, then basically at a certain point, the production side is not able to continue producing, even though everything works. There's nothing compromised. There's been no internal attack on the OT system or an intrusion into the OT network, but there's still an effective stoppage of the OT environment because of dependent IT on the enterprise side. So I would say that, but definitely there are APT attacks and there are APT reconnaissance of OT environments and manufacturers. So maybe panelists, what are your thoughts around kind of APT related activities and AI for maybe discovering those activities or otherwise?
I'll let Itay start if you have some thoughts.
Okay. I think APTs would become more and more dangerous. They would be more sophisticated. They'd be smarter. So they'll not be just like, okay, and definitely they won't need communication back all the time. If their goal is to come in and do something bad at A, B, C date, they would
Right.
get in and they would wait and they would find a way how to propagate inside the network, making the separation and segregation between the IT and the OT, and even between OT to OT, extremely important for the organization. And finally, they would also use polymorphic malware and other mechanisms to hide themselves from EDRs and antiviruses that are embedded into that network.
So I'm gonna take it a certain direction here because it's kind of an interesting conversation. Specifically, I think the question was around almost like a supply chain attack on a machine that was brought into a facility, or that it was from overseas and it was brought in and that the APT already had persistence inside the machine. Right. And so this is where the use case of the diode comes in because command and control does not become a thing anymore.
Right.
Right, we're breaking the command and control chain through the diode, but there's a lot of argument around, hey, APTs are going to do what they can in order to get in. Once they're in, try to exfiltrate any information about the systems that are attached to it, and then start designing attacks around it. Now, this is the attack, assuming that we're talking about the OT infrastructure itself, right? As you stated, Tim, like you could attack the IT infrastructure, lose visibility into what's happening into the OT system, and then now you need to shut down, right? Like that's happened in the past. That's a historical attack. Just because you lose visibility or fear that there's a potential, connection between A and B, so between the IT and the OT. So I think, there's a reason, though, actually, to another point, another use case. Oftentimes, any compute or any kind of system which can be scanned, oftentimes asset owners are holding on to those assets for a period of time so that AV signatures and the like can do some maturity, and even AI is helping to
Right.
examine some of those files and those file systems. And so they'll hold on to those and then set a date for here's when we're going to scan it. And at that point, now we've done a scan, we've built up some time as far as signature and definitions. Now we can look at it and say whether or not it's a usable product.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's an excellent use case in terms of AI now, particularly in the OT environment. There's, OPSWAT one, but there's a lot of vendors essentially that are leveraging the power of AI to speed up that discovery of assets, but also learning what is normal when there's, data that they're collecting on process data and whatnot. So that's one way that it's being leveraged for the good. As far as like APTs and the use of AI, if it's not the supply chain, embedded device that an APT already has control over going into an OT, I would just say just more broadly, um, the problem is that AI as a tool, when it's in the hands of an adversary, makes all the adversaries more effective. And my concern isn't necessarily as much about the APTs because they were already pretty sophisticated. It's actually more in terms of like the amount of attacks and the sophistication of the attacks, more on the less sophisticated actors, or maybe they were somewhat sophisticated on the enterprise IT, but they're not James. They don't know if James turned into a bad guy, it would be very bad. But there's not as many Jameses in the world. So if you can take basically a regular, coder on the enterprise IT side and give him a tool set that was going to be able to map out and figure out which protocols are in that environment, which devices may be there to write, things for that environment, that's actually sort of more my nightmare scenario.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And in fact, there was a survey last year from SANS that only said roughly only about 30% of the organizations are planning around agentic AI attacks. And to me, that's mind-boggling knowing where we are right now, right? Because again, and I even said this at the time, I was like, it was 1997 that Deep Blue beat the Grandmaster in chess. That was almost 30 years ago.
Right.
Right. And I don't play AI chess, like not like that. Right. I'll watch. I'll just sit back and watch those guys play each other because as far as I'm concerned, I can't beat that mind, you know. So it's the whole join them, right? You got to use AI to defend. And to your point, I think it is a scary time when I just have to say, what is this machine doing?
Right. Yeah, I have a very, very smart 9-year-old, and I started losing to him last year. So I'm not playing AI chess. Um, the next question by the same person is basically asking essentially moving the AI, but also extending it. So it's like as we're moving towards quantum, right? What is that going to do to like cybersecurity and OT? And I think that the quickest answer, if you haven't figured it out already, is whether it's agentic AI being used maliciously or quantum and the effects that either of those are going to have, going back to defensible architecture and things that are not code, like a data diode, become all the more important because that's not something that quantum can crack. We're talking about physical limitations versus logical limitations. So,
Well, we're seeing that now, and we've got a number of customers that are, implementing quantum key solutions, and their concern is, how do I get these keys securely into my high security network? And we're deploying diodes to ensure, the typical things that we've got unidirectional data flow, and that nothing can flow back out of the high security network. So these types of use cases, while they're relatively new, they are happening, and we're seeing, a growth in the market, pretty rapid growth in terms of customers coming to us to look at how to, secure the transfer of quantum keys into high security networks.
that's great. Yeah, I'm not shocked about that.
I'm
Itay?
interested in quantum communications piece of things, right? Where you can communicate over quantum to, affect something over here just by doing something over here. Uh,
Right.
like, that truly is the holy grail, if you will, of communication. But I just don't know how practical that is in the OT environment. And it is the same. It produces the same question around things like cryptography in OT networks, right? Because as soon as we start applying cryptography, then we start losing visibility. And so how do you maintain visibility and the whole cryptography without impacting the process times, right? I mean, the other thing, we don't want to add more overhead to what we're already doing. So yeah, these are interesting questions.
Itay, you wanna get in on this?
I think they answered most of it, but quantum is extremely important. You need to make sure that your crypto solutions that you put in are future-proof, because don't do a change now and in 5 years, oh, damn, I need to do another. So just make sure whatever you put in would be with you for a long time.
Yeah, important. Um, I think we've got one thing. OPSWAT has a self-assessment tool that is free, and I think we can show something about that and where you can go. Excellent. There's the link, so you can go ahead and take the free self-assessment. I don't know, Mark, if you want to explain, or Itai, James.
This is a simple self-assessment, a fairly easy tool to use. Just I think some simple questions that are inside of it. But I even this, right? This is an iterative process, right? Always asking, is it good enough? Is it good enough? Is it good enough? We know in security is always in a state of decay. Nothing is, continuously secure. Over time, it decays, right? So making sure that we're doing continuous assessments. Yep.
Excellent. Yeah, it's a pretty simple free tool, so take advantage of it. And I think we've got a little bit more time for some Q&A, and we've got a few more questions that popped up. So this one is basically asking about industrial AI product suppliers and integration services that are coming with certifications or best practices, good practices, which are kind of worth looking at. I don't think that in this session we're going to talk about particular vendors, but maybe we can give some things that they should be thinking about if there's industrial AI products, solutions, integration tools to look for.
I stand behind the garbage in, garbage out. So making sure that how we're feeding those systems. I don't care who the vendor is, making sure that there's a pathway for producing clean data, right? That should be, if you're buying any kind of AI or any kind of, I don't know if you guys have ever, tried to transition systems like MRP or, like if you change those systems, it's incredibly challenging because oftentimes some of those things have a lot of garbage in them already. And so there's some time that it takes to filter out all that stuff. And, that the garbage that models feed on, they're just going to, they're taking in the data that you give them. And so I do think that we're going to see an increase in those. But what's also interesting too, so I don't want to paint a bad picture, but this is back to what I was saying before. What if the, agentic AI or the AI that's being used in some of these systems can be leveraged for nefarious purposes, right? What does that look like? I don't need to bring malware into the system if the system is capable of producing malware by itself.
Right.
So
yeah, I will say last week I was at MIT for like a Google Cloud MIT AI manufacturing event, and at this small Google meeting with asset owners, um, one of the things that was a particular concern was essentially vendor capture. And to your point, James, that if you go ahead and invest in a tool or a solution, that if you want to go a different direction, it's pretty hard to unwind some of that. So, yeah, do your due diligence beforehand, and before you pull the trigger. Anyone else want to comment on that before we move on?
I
I
was
would
just
just
going to
say,
say, I think it's
go ahead. Sorry.
at the risk of sounding like a broken record, I think it's very important to understand, what your environment looks like, what you want to accomplish. and what you perceive as your highest risks. AI is everywhere now. It is also a buzzword, so it's important to really, have a lot of focus on what you want to get out of your AI solution in your OT environment, and what other vulnerabilities do you need to address at the same time. There's a ton of cybersecurity products out there. Uh, so it's really important to understand your priorities. I see customers all the time go out and get security audits by third-party vendors, and they come up with 50 things to address. And in many cases, it's not going to be viable from a cost standpoint or from a time standpoint to address all 50 of those items. So it's really important to hone in on, what are the top 5 items out of that 50? What are the, top 10 items? And really focus your time, energy, and resources on those areas that are going to give you the biggest bang for the buck and eliminate the highest risks.
Yep, definitely.
I,
That manufacturer is
I
probably not going to make it past number 3 on the assessment. But yeah.
well, that goes exactly toward my next point. A little bit of optimism toward the end of the call. Uh, Use AI also. The fact that the attackers use AI also. Use him to do the assessment, use him to give you prioritization of what you need to solve before. Make him do your job. Address part of the skill gap that everybody suffered for the last few years, and invest a little bit in an account in Claude that you can actually ask questions and see what's going on and give him the information. And he will be your assistant. He will do the things. And also, when needed, he can take some actions for you. So, this is another opportunity to not only be afraid of AI, but to embrace AI and utilize it forward.
Tim, you're muted.
Well, thanks, Itay, for leaving us on a somewhat more positive note as
A little bit.
we sign off here. The last question, which I think we already answered, which basically like AI leveraged against asset inventory, and I think yes, the answer is AI will be useful alongside pre-existing tools for asset inventory, which is always a problem for OT. I know it's a problem because when I'm walking past the OPSWAT table and all the vendors at S4, everyone does asset inventory, which tells me that no one's environment, their asset inventory is that great. So yes, hopefully the AI can help with that as well. We are basically at time. So first of all, I want to thank OPSWAT and all the guys from OPSWAT for coming on and answering some of my questions. And for you, I'm sure that there's an ability to follow up with them and ask questions or reach out to them after this call. And then also go out and take the self-assessment tool and use it because I think it'll be useful. Also, just internally in your own organization to ask some of those questions and bring some of those findings to maybe your own leadership as a starting place for figuring out how you're going to improve your program.